Welcome to this evening's event. Welcome to Enna Temple Hall for this special evening. It's great to see so many people here. Tonight, you're going to be hearing from the chair of the Bar of England and Wales, Nick Vineall KC, on his thoughts for the future as we look ahead 20 years to 2043. I was delighted to be invited by Nick to chair this event as someone who was called to the bar just over 20 years ago, perhaps closer to a quarter of a century ago, I'm terrified to say. I'm really looking forward to thinking about what's changed in that period of time and perhaps what hasn't. So I'm going to be probing some of the issues that Nick is going to talk about in his presentation straight afterwards in an in-conversation event that's going to take place over there. But before we start, I've got a small bit of housekeeping. First of all, there's no planned fire drills, so if you hear the fire alarm, please proceed to your nearest fire exit. I'm afraid I can't do that, I'm not entirely sure where they are, but I'm sure somebody that way. Thank you very much, I've had a point. Tonight's session is being recorded for those who are unable to attend in person. And please do share your thoughts through social media and tag the Bar Council. The handle is on the slides. There's going to be a few graphs on the screen during Nick's talk, and we're going to be providing you with a link to download them at the end. So don't worry if you don't either have a phone on you or you'd rather actually look at them slower time. So Nick Vineall KC requires very little introduction. Before taking up his position as chair of the bar, Nick was joint head of chambers at Four Pump Court, where he practices in commercial, construction and financial services law in both litigation and international arbitration. He also sat as a Deputy High Court judge in the King's Bench Division and has a long history of involvement with the Bar Council, including as former chair of the Education and Training Committee and of the Regulatory Review Working Group. And almost 30 years ago, Nick was chair of the Young Bar, no doubt thinking about his own future at the bar. Nick, over to you.
Thank you very much, Fiona. So what will the bar look like in 20 years' time? And what are the challenges we are likely to face as a profession? What indeed do we want it to look like? I hope I might be around in 20 years' time. And if so, I hope what I will see then is a thriving bar which is a true meritocracy, in which the ablest succeed irrespective of background or gender or race. I would like to see a bar which remains overwhelmingly a referral profession and which provides excellent service to its clients whilst remaining true to its first duty, which is to the court. Because if we advise and represent our clients without fear or favour, always fulfilling our ethical obligations, but never judging our clients, that is the best way to support the courts, judges and juries, in fulfilling their function of dispensing justice. Can I say at the outset that I'm going to disappoint those of you who have come hoping to hear my views on some of the profoundly important changes which society faces more broadly, things like climate change, our post-Brexit relationship with Europe. These are not, I think, bar-specific issues, and they're also issues on which I have neither special knowledge nor experience. Nor, I don't know whether people will be pleased or sorry about this, am I going to talk today about regulation, except tangentially. It is important, but there have been and will be other opportunities to talk about that. And nor am I going to talk today about the crucially important issue of access to justice. We will certainly be talking about this at the party conferences and asking the major parties what their plans are. But my focus today is on the future shape and structures of our profession. They may not be the most critical issues to broader society, but they are important for us. And many of them are issues which are within our own control and where we have the power to make things better. The structure of our profession is essentially that you go in at the bottom and gradually work your way up. So what the junior end of the profession looks like now is the single biggest determinant of what the senior end of the profession will look like in 20 years. So I wanted to begin with some facts and figures. And let's first wind the clock back 20 years and look at the overall demographic of the practicing bar in 2003. So by practicing bar, I mean all the barristers with practicing certificates. So practicing as a barrister either in employment or as a self-employed barrister, typically in chambers somewhere. And this slide, some of you will have seen slides of this sort before and some perhaps not, but the blocks going up are in 8-year brackets of call. So the block at the bottom is the people who in 2003 were of 0 to 7 years call. And then the block above that is the people who were then at 8 to 15 years call. And orange is for women and blue is for men. So you can see that if the bar was of a consistent size overall, you'd expect a kind of pyramid, because people go in at the bottom and gradually people leave as they get more senior. And you can broadly see that pyramid shape in 2003. But you can also see the skew between men and women very clearly on this sort of way of showing the demographic of the bar. So if you look at people who 20 years ago were between 24 and 31 years call, there were 290 women and almost 1,700 men. So there was a real skew, but you can also see, even 20 years ago in the 0 to 7 years bracket, it's not as skewed in the people who'd recently been called as before. And we can look at the same graph, the same presentation now in 2023. And it's quite interesting and inevitable, of course, that I'm in the 32 to 39 years call bracket. So in my bracket, there are 1,434 men and only 482 women. And of course that reflects what we saw on the previous slide from 20 years before. But if you look down towards the bottom, you can see that at the 0 to 7 years bracket of call, the practicing bar is actually relatively balanced, 1,478 women and 1,520 men. But the other thing you'll notice about it is that that pyramid shape is a little bit different. And in fact, it's got a rather narrow base at the bottom. So there is a bit of a bulge moving up the profession. And you can see those numbers at the bottom being smaller. And you can, in fact, superimpose the two so that the grey is what we saw in 2003 and the colours are what we can see now. So quite interesting just to look at the 0 to 7 years call bracket, smaller than it was 20 years ago, but much closer to being balanced. And we need to think about the challenges that gives rise to. And the Bar Council tries to model the size of the profession going forward. That is inevitably an imprecise task. But we think in terms of practicing barristers, the bar is likely to stabilise in size over the next 10 years or so at about the 18,000 mark. It's about 17,500 at the moment. But before we move on, let's look in a bit more detail at the current intake to the practicing bar. So that's people who succeed through pupillage and start practice. And if we aggregate the last 3 years of entry, these are the figures in terms of ethnicity. So you can see the number of barristers completing pupillage in each ethnic group. And on the right, we've given the figures for the equivalent mix of the population at age 25 to 29. And you can see, if you find figures easy to take in at a glance, that there's a pretty good correlation. It's much easier to see with a pie chart. And so that pie chart shows all round the outside of the target the population in England and Wales aged 25 to 29. And then it shows on the inner pie chart the proportion of people coming to the bar in the last 3 years, coming into practice at the bar in the last 3 years by comparison. And just as the figures showed, you can see there is actually a pretty close correlation between the people who are coming to the bar in terms of ethnic mix and their cohort in wider society. And for gender, the figures for the last 3 years for entry to the practicing bar are that women very marginally outnumbered men at 51% to 49%. And our projections suggest that in 2043, looking 20 years hence, the practicing bar overall will be about 45% women and 55% men. And in the call bracket of up to 20 years call, women will outnumber men. So in terms of recruitment to the practicing bar, we now have an intake that very closely reflects the general population demographic in terms of gender and race. And I think that that is important. It is what you would hope to see if recruitment is open and meritocratic. And I think enormous credit here is due to the inns, and especially their student officers, and credit also due to pupillage and tenancy selection committees for their work in trying to ensure there's no unconscious bias, and to organisations like Bridging the Bar and the Bar Council's Equality and Diversity Committee and all the people who do outreach. It's good. Notice too that when we talk about recruitment to the bar, this is an area where the practicing bar has a large degree of autonomy in who we seek to attract and in who we select. And I think we can be proud that we seem at the recruitment stage to be well on the way to a race-neutral, gender-neutral intake, and therefore well on the way to a meritocracy. What we don't have a very good handle on is the social background, how the social background of the practicing bar compares with the population as a whole. Now that is partly because it's a difficult thing to measure and to track, and partly because when we do ask people questions about their social background, not enough people are prepared to answer. But I think we can probably agree on two things: that the bar and the inns can be very daunting, very off-putting at first blush for those who come from what are sometimes called non-traditional backgrounds, although I don't particularly like that expression. And second, what we ought to be interested in when we recruit to pupillage is potential. How good a barrister you can soon become. And that may not be exactly the same as what grades and extracurricular activities you can put on your CV. And I would suggest we also need to ask ourselves whether we're entirely comfortable that of those who disclose the relevant information, about 35% of the current intake to the practicing bar is privately educated, as against 18% of the A-level cohort and only 8% of all secondary school pupils. So I felt for a long time that on recruitment we can still do better on the social mobility front. And I said in my inaugural address in January that I was keen to explore whether we could support and build on the excellent outreach work of the inns by making available contextual recruitment tools as part of the pupillage gateway process. Contextual recruitment tools help to identify candidates who have outperformed their immediate peer group, in the school they went to, or who have had to overcome particular types of adversity. And those tools can help chambers ensure that they are not missing candidates who in fact have great potential, but who, because of their background, might not yet have achieved quite so highly as contemporaries from a more advantaged background. And I'm delighted to be able to say that the Bar Council and TribePad, who provide the applicant tracking system which sits behind the pupillage gateway, are going to be working with Rare Recruitment to integrate Rare's extremely impressive and carefully developed contextual recruitment tools into the gateway. Now, I stress, whether or not chambers want to use those tools, look at the flags and markers that those tools provide, is up to chambers. There's nothing compulsory about this, but it's available for those who wish to use it, and chambers may, some already do, want to use it, for instance, at the stage of deciding who to invite to interview. The cost will be included in the gateway subscription fee, so there'll be no separate cost for those who wish to use it. This won't be available for the coming round, but it will be available ahead of the opening of the 2025 round, which will be towards the end of the next year. And I really hope that there will be widespread use of these tools. So I've talked about recruitment, but that's only the first task in achieving a meritocratic profession. We also need to address progression and retention. And this is where we undoubtedly need to focus our ongoing efforts. Now, here the profession is not in full control of all the contributory factors, in a sense in contradistinction to recruitment. As an obvious example, how you progress at the bar will depend on what work you get. And that depends, at least in part, on client choices. But even those choices may not be beyond the realms of our influence. We will be publishing our annual update on earnings disparities by race and gender later this year, and we think we've improved the analysis and presentation. And in terms of gender, there is a clear and very pervasive overall disparity between the earnings of men and women, and that won't be a surprise because that's what we've known for some time. That is driven in part, and I think we can see this more clearly now than in the past, by a particularly marked disparity seen in the highest earners, who are very disproportionately men. And similarly, with race, we know from the work of the Bar Council's Race Working Group that the average black barrister earns markedly less than the average white barrister, and the average black woman earns less than the average black man. And we need to do more work to understand exactly the cause or causes of these differences. But some of the work we have done recently with individual chambers suggests that there may be hard to justify disparities in work allocation, in who actually does what, in the very early years of practice, which, perhaps not surprisingly, can have a lasting impact on career trajectories. And we will have more to say about all of that in October. So looking forward to 2043, I think the picture is mixed in terms of equality and diversity. We can already be sure that the bar of 2043 will be much more diverse and much more closely reflect the mix of race and gender in society than the bar as it is today. So in terms of getting in, we appear to operate pretty meritocratically, although we may have more to do in terms of social mobility. I haven't said anything about disability because our data is not good, but we continue to try to improve the support available to those disabled people who can, with reasonable adjustments, build a successful practice at the bar. But the key takeaway is that in terms of staying in, and particularly in terms of getting on, that is to say retention and progression, we have much more to do. So I want then to turn to a different issue, which is what practice might look like for those who come to the bar in the next 20 years, or it's still around in 20 years' time. Will it be transformed by AI? Personally, I doubt it, although I'm sure our practices will be affected by AI to some extent. One specific subset of AI which I wanted to talk about has caught the public imagination. Large language models, or LLMs, of which ChatGPT is the best known, have already been used and I think abused in litigation, and it is important for us as a profession to understand both their capabilities and their limitations. LLMs like ChatGPT can produce text in response to prompts, which is often extremely convincing, though I think usually less than wholly inspiring. But what is it actually doing? Is it thinking? Is it intelligent? No, it isn't. LLMs are developed by first scouring the internet for text on a phenomenally broad basis, and then using complex mathematics, which I don't begin to understand, to create a linguistic model from that data. And that program, which models the relationship between words, but has no sense of their meaning, allows the program to respond to text prompts in a way which produces text which is a relevant response to the prompts and which conveys meaning to its human readers and which makes a very good stab at sounding as though a real person produced it. It's like predictive texting on steroids. It is not the same as an internet search. And as one academic has described it, LLMs are good at formal competence, the knowledge of linguistic rules, but not functional competence, understanding and using language in the world. So in the next 20 years, LLMs will, I am sure, be increasingly used for all sorts of things. But as barristers, I suggest that we need to recognize the following key points, and I'm grateful to the Bar Council's IT panel for their assistance here. First, AI is not intelligent in any normally understood sense of the word. LLMs do not think. Second, LLMs, large language models, neither tell the truth nor lie. They just produce text. The meaning of the text might be true or false. In some widely reported recent instances, LLMs have managed to make up things which are entirely false, even producing false references to support the text. Third, the text which LLMs produce obviously depends on the content of the text that was originally scoured from the internet. As a result, biases and prejudices in that text will be reflected in the output of the LLMs. And because the internet scouring process takes ages and is costly, it is not done on a frequent basis, so that the raw data may not be up to date. And fourthly, and perhaps most importantly, with many of these LLMs, the text you put in by way of a prompt can itself be used by that model more generally. So great care is required not to divulge information which is privileged or confidential. So I very much doubt that we will be replaced by robots or chatbots or AI, at least in the next 20 years, but we do need to make it our business to understand what AI can do and to understand enough about how it does it so that we can appreciate both its capacities and weaknesses. A head-in-the-sands approach is not remotely sensible, but neither should you be asking ChatGPT to settle your skeleton arguments. I think that a development which is much more likely to affect our practices in the next 20 years is the growing realization that court-based dispute resolution is, or at least ought to be, a last resort, to be used only when other alternative methods of dispute resolution, or at least other peaceful alternative methods of dispute resolution, have been tried without success. The mandatory use of ADR of some sort as a precursor to bringing or continuing proceedings is, I think, likely to increase. And although that will itself create opportunities for barristers, I think it may be that its net effect will be to close off more work than it opens up for the bar. On compulsory ADR, the Bar Council will be intervening in an important Court of Appeal case this autumn, which is likely to consider whether and in what circumstances a court can direct ADR as a mandatory precursor. Watch this space. What about working patterns and the future of the Chamber's working model and remote hearings? Well, I suspect that some increase in the use of remote hearings above pre-COVID levels is here to stay, but I hope that their use will reduce from present levels. We're still analysing the responses we got from the bar in the Barristers' Working Life survey, but I count myself in the camp which believes that the right approach to any materially dispositive hearing, so we're not talking here about extensions of time for service of a defence, but for materially dispositive hearings, the starting point is that they should be done in person and not online. Online hearings risk breeding sloppiness and informality. And I believe that, save where there are very good reasons to the contrary, people's rights and obligations should be determined face-to-face, with a proper degree of formality, in a real room to which the public and journalists have access, and in which every participant can see and hear everyone, and can see and hear everything that is happening. And we have a name for rooms like that. They're called courts. But leaving aside the question of remote hearings, remote working is obviously here to stay. But I think there are important challenges for us as a profession here as well. Being a barrister is rewarding, but it can also be deeply stressful. There are perennial problems of work-life balance, and particularly for the young bar, managing debt loads. We've all had clients who've lost cases, and we convince ourselves that it's entirely our own fault. We've almost all had judges say things to us which we know are grossly unfair, although we cannot tell them why. We have all had those sets of papers where actually we just don't know where to start. And so, from time to time, we all need support. I think the criminal bar can be especially stressful, but at least for criminal practitioners in court almost every day, robing rooms provide a chance to interact with colleagues and friends. I worry particularly about civil practitioners with paper-based practices who may go for long periods with little face-to-face professional interaction. I wish I had a simple answer to that issue. I suspect this is one of those problems where we have to learn to help ourselves by understanding and thinking about well-being. We need to make the effort when things are going well and we don't particularly need mutual support networks to build up those networks. And that way we can be around when colleagues need our help, but also we won't be starting from cold when it's we who need help. And that's perhaps a roundabout way of saying, go to circuit messes, get involved in your SBA, make the effort to go into chambers, attend chambers social events, get involved with your inn, or get involved in the Bar Council, or maybe even do all of those. What about traditional chambers model itself? Is that sustainable? By traditional model, I mean a group of barristers combining to pay for clerks and marketing and rental of rooms and so on, but without a profit share, and crucially perhaps, in the traditional model, without any external equity investment. I see no reason why this model should not survive, and great benefits if it does. It tends to avoid or minimize conflicts problems. It means that there are no external investors to take a share of income, and very often there is in practice an attractive cross-subsidy of junior members of the profession by those who are more established. I certainly benefited from that cross-subsidy when I started at the bar, and I'll be very happy when I return to Chambers in January to go back to that kind of system. But there is at least one interesting variant on the traditional model at the moment. An organisation called Clerks' Room has 240 or so barristers, and remember there are only 17,500 practicing barristers, has 240 or so barristers on its books, including 8 silks. And the barristers contract individually with a corporate body, Clerks' Room, which provides clerking services in exchange for a percentage-based fee. The holding company of Clerks' Room recently announced it had attracted funding in an 8-figure sum, so that must be at least 10 million, from a Lloyds Bank subsidiary to develop its business. And it has a very client-focused website, and there's another business in the same group called Clerks' Room Direct, which acts as a portal for direct access work. Now, this sort of model is interesting, and it may offer benefits for clients, and it may offer benefits for the external investors. What is less clear to me is the long-term benefit for barristers. The history of outside party investment in solicitors' businesses, for instance, Insers and Plexus, has so far not been one of conspicuous success. But it may be that this, I think, first example at the bar will turn out better for the equity investors. Notice that, strictly speaking, the investment by Lloyds Bank is not in an entity which is itself providing legal services. It's in the corporate body which provides the clerking services. But this type of model will nevertheless require careful handling from a regulatory and conflicts perspective. And rather like what I said about well-being, the broader answer here may be for us as barristers to be careful that we take care of ourselves. Perhaps if there is some monetization available from investing more into our traditional models, we might prefer it if it were we as barristers were the investors and therefore the owners of the benefits that might come from such innovation and investment. And if we don't do that, we should not be surprised to find that the fruits of our labours, our fee income, has to be shared with the external investors who were prepared to take on the risk of investing. Finally, I want to turn to an issue which I see as a serious challenge to our profession as we look to the future. It's one which has crept up on us stealthily, although not entirely unnoticed. We have as a profession thought about it before and come close to resolving it, but never in the end done anything about it. It's about as fundamental as any question could be, because it's about what makes you a barrister. And what makes you entitled to use the protected title barrister is being called by the bar, by one of the 4 Inns of Court. But, strangely in my view, we confer the title of barrister on people who are not entitled to practice as barristers. In order to become a barrister, you need to get a qualifying law degree with a 2-2 or better, or convert your degree using the graduate diploma. You need to complete 10 qualifying sessions with your Inn of Court, and you need to pass the vocational course offered by one of the now 10 providers. These are courses which the BSB permits you to pass in dribs and drabs over no fewer than 5 years. So you can become a barrister without ever having practiced and without even having done pupillage, and you will retain that title for life. Contrast becoming a solicitor. The main route to becoming a solicitor is that a person must have a qualifying law degree and complete the legal practice course, so that's very similar to the bar route, but would-be solicitors must also complete 2 years of recognised training, training contract typically, before they become a solicitor. There is in fact nothing of substance you can do as a result of being called to the bar. You acquire no rights of audience. You can of course have your photograph taken on call day in a wig and gown and put it on your or your proud parents' mantelpiece. But in order to exercise the rights of audience that we associate with being a barrister, you have to get pupillage, and you have to complete pupillage to be entitled to full practicing certificate. As a result of our present arrangements, there are far more barristers who are non-practicing than are practicing. And actually, I think there are really three categories of barrister. Practicing barristers who have a practicing certificate, barristers who were once entitled to practice but no longer have a practicing certificate, and those who have never obtained or been able to obtain a practicing certificate because they never did pupillage. And we can look at the numbers in each category and see how they have developed over the years. So this says status of barristers under 50 years call, annual snapshot. So time runs from left to right. We've excluded barristers over 50 years call because frankly nobody's terribly clear how many of them might still be alive actually, rather than still practicing. So we have to have a sort of notional cutoff, but that seems probably in roughly the right place. But you can see that really quite striking pattern with the size of the practicing bar in blue, certainly increasing, but increasing relatively slowly. Latest figure, it always depends what time of the year you take the snapshot, whether it's, but 17,300 in 2022, another 10,412 unregistered barristers who have practiced, but then 37,000 who have never been entitled to practice. So if we take a snapshot of the position now, and again limit it to those under 50 years call, we get a pie chart like that. So for every barrister with a practicing certificate, there are 2 who've never been entitled to a practicing certificate, broadly speaking. And of all the people in the world who are entitled to tell you they are a barrister called to the Bar of England and Wales, only 1 in 4 has a practicing certificate. And another way of looking at this is to look each year at the number of people called to the Bar of England and Wales as against those starting pupillage. And that's all barristers called against time. Now, you can see at the end of that graph, it's pretty erratic. That's obviously COVID. And you also have to be very cautious about, really ignore the 2022-23 year figures because that year isn't finished. But you can see the basic pattern. That includes overseas students. But if we take out the overseas students, who are probably almost all of them never intending to practice here, and just stick to students with British or Irish nationalities, we still see a big difference between the number called and the number who go into pupillage. So we have a system in which we call to the bar large numbers of non-UK domiciled students, even though they will almost invariably have to complete pupillage in their own jurisdiction before they can practice there. It's not as though being called to the bar here passports them into rights in their home jurisdiction. And we also call far more British Isles domiciled students than will ever get pupillage. The chance of eventually getting pupillage, if you're from Britain or Ireland, is somewhere between 1/2 and 2/3. So the result is that the bar as a whole is getting bigger and bigger, while the practicing bar stays about constant. For every practicing barrister, there are another 3 who either haven't practiced or once practiced and don't. Does that matter? Does any of that matter? And if it does, what should we do about it? Well, I think it does matter for 5 reasons. First, And perhaps most importantly, from a public interest point of view, there is a real risk of confusion for clients, or in the more modern parlance, consumer detriment. Who is this person who tells me they're a barrister? What can they and what can't they do? The rules about holding out and unregistered barristers are a quagmire likely to be incomprehensible to most lay people, to most clients. They are certainly confusing for unregistered barristers, as evidenced by the many calls to the Bar Council's Ethics Helpline on that very subject, and by the fact that almost every year at least one unregistered barrister is subject to disciplinary proceedings for holding themselves out as a barrister in connection with the provision of legal services, which they're not allowed to do. And as I've already said, the position in terms of the use of the title barrister is in stark contrast to the position for those who are entitled to call themselves dentists, pharmacists, or closest to home solicitors. There simply is not parity between the two. That must be very confusing for people. So that's the first reason, which is the pure public interest argument. It's confusing. Second, the creation of this mass of unregistered barristers, I think, creates an unfair financial burden on practicing barristers. Once you have a protected title, like barrister or solicitor, you need both to regulate its use and regulate the conduct of those entitled to use it. Regulation is increasingly costly. The BSB's budget this year is nearly 15 million. And the great majority of that cost burden falls on those who pay the practicing certificate fee. You get the invoice every year, you know. So 17,000 or so practicing barristers pay for the regulation of 70,000 or so people. And it's striking, I think, that unregistered barristers who have never been entitled to practice, ones who never did pupillage, account for over a quarter of cases that get to the bar tribunal. So this is not a large mass of people who in practice don't trouble the regulatory system. They do. The third reason is that I believe that some people embark on the bar course who in truth have little prospect of securing pupillage. It may, I think, be a reasonable inference that they console themselves with the idea that even though they may never be able to practice as a barrister, they will become a barrister nonetheless. If you have a 2-2, you have only about a 1 in 10 chance of securing pupillage. But if you pass the bar course, you nevertheless become a barrister. So I fear that the system artificially encourages some people who probably should not be encouraged, and they are being encouraged to do something which is very expensive. Fourth, maybe more importantly, I believe the present system is likely to discourage some of the young people who do have what it takes and who ought to be encouraged. If you are a really bright, sensible and ambitious 20-something with no bank of mummy and daddy to fall back on, and you are trying to decide whether to go for the bar or to be a solicitor, we have created a system that I think makes the bar look distinctly unattractive by comparison with becoming a solicitor. So not only do we have a system that sometimes encourages the wrong people, but I fear that we are unnecessarily discouraging some of the best people. Fifthly, and perhaps most importantly from our profession's point of view, I think that if we continue as we are, we will create wholly unnecessary and eminently avoidable risks to our continued existence as an independent profession. If the profession of barrister is going to continue, surely it must mean something. The title barrister must be meaningful. At the moment, it means little more than that you have completed the bar course. So there is, in truth, no connection between the title and professional practice, what you can do. And remember that there are some strident critics of the present regulatory system. They describe the present system pejoratively as a system of regulation by title. They would like to see all lawyers regulated according to function, and some of them would like to see a single regulator. I disagree. I want to see our profession continue as a separate profession, separately regulated. But for so long as we continue to confer the title of barrister in circumstances where the title has no correlation with what you're actually entitled to do, I think we make the job of our critics easier. So I'm delighted that the Inns are looking at these issues again. The vocational course providers can and should, of course, confer a qualification to recognise success on the vocational course, but more should be required before you become entitled to call yourself a barrister. My own view is that we should call people to the bar only when they have satisfactorily completed pupillage with some sort of provisional call or provisional practicing certificate to cover the second 6. The Bar Council strongly supports such a change. I was reading today Duncan Matthews' QC, as he then was, paper for the Bar Council from 2005, which said the Bar Council strongly supports such a change. My strong sense is that the practicing bar as a whole is in favour of such a change, and that those practicing barristers who are closest in time to having experienced the present arrangements are the most firmly in support of change. And it is therefore particularly important that when the Inns consider this issue, that they do take proper account of the views of those who will still be barristers in 20 years' time. So to summarise, we have this, I have to say, I think, obvious anomaly of conferring the title barrister before the qualification process is complete, and I fear that if we do nothing, the problem will get worse, it will become increasingly difficult to resolve, and that it poses a long-term risk to the profession. The problem is readily fixable, and it should be fixed soon. We must all rise to the challenge. Before I sit down and am asked difficult questions by Fiona, can I briefly pay tribute to my colleagues at the Bar Council, both members of the Bar Council and staff, and to all the people, many of whom are here, and I can see, who through the SBAs or the circuits or the Inns contribute to the work of the Bar Council in relation to CALL, the Education Training Committee and the Regulatory Working Group, but all of you have very much contributed to the forward thinking which I have just tried to articulate. Thank you.
Nick, I'm going to start with social mobility, if I may. You touched on the importance of recruitment. We saw some interesting statistics about the proportion of barrister entrants who are privately educated versus those who aren't. And I suppose you talked about the contextual tool, which also sounds very promising. What more needs to happen in order to ensure that the bar properly represents the society that it serves?
Well, I think recognising what we're trying to do is really important. And one of the things I would say is there's a lot of intersectionality in terms of social background and other protected characteristics, obviously race in particular. And so we don't want to put these challenges in silos, so the things we can do about race are important as well. I just feel we have such a competitive profession at entry that there are some things which can cast a long shadow. So if in your sixth form you drop 2 grades below what you wanted to get, that will almost certainly affect the university you go to, and that can in a sense, cast a long shadow. And I think that the message on this is not about actually giving a leg up to second-rate people. This is about making sure you identify the first-rate people, the really good people. And I think that mindset is quite important to us. And all of the outreach work, things like bridging the bar, buildings like this are wonderful. They're profoundly impressive buildings, but if you're not used to buildings like this, you will be quaking in your boots the first time you come to an inn. That's the reality, I think. It's so unfamiliar to many people, and I think we all have an obligation to help with outreach and do what we can.
You've mentioned intersectionality, and we all know, well, there's good evidence to say that good awareness helps us to not only acknowledge the differences between different groups, different individuals, but it can also help us to ensure that systems are fairer. So what can be done to improve the data or indeed anything else to ensure that that can be improved?
Yeah. We asked lots of questions in the Barristers Working Life survey, and we have got quite a good response rate this year, but not everybody responds. It would be really good if people responded, and it would be good if people answered questions. There's a really deep-seated resistance in some people to answering the questions, which I don't fully understand. Maybe it's because they don't believe that the answers will be confidential. They will be confidential, I promise. But that would help on the data front.
You hinted also, moving on to retention and recruitment, that there is effectively more that could be done to ensure that there isn't disparity in work allocation. I say hinted, and you also, I think, trailed that there may be more to come in October. I just wondered if I could press
tease out a bit. Well, there will be some more figures, and I think probably better presented figures in October. Allocation of work is clearly very important, and it's such a complicated mix between the clerk's room and the reaction of barristers when asked if they're prepared to do something tomorrow they hadn't been anticipating doing, and client choices. We've worked with the LPMA and the Institute of Barristers Clerks on materials to look, when you're doing practice reviews, at the sort of factors which people are concerned about. And we've done a lot of work with the clerks and the practice managers on work allocation. It's good work. It's got to be put into practice. I think with all of these things, you might even have some resistance in chambers to having policies in place. But my word, that is absolutely only the first stage. If you have a policy which you put in the bottom drawer, you might as well not have bothered having the policy. These problems are not going to resolve themselves on their own. You have to put it into practice. And there are some, crystallized ideas for what people can do.
So look forward to reading more about that in October, hearing more about that in October.
More in October, but a lot already available. There's guidance on practice reviews. There's a lot of guidance on allocation of work, which you can, if you don't know where it is, you find it through the Bar Council website.
So moving on to parity of pay. So you talked about the difference between different groups in terms of earnings. How can things be improved there to make it fairer at the bar?
Well, again, obviously one wishes one had a complete answer. We are getting much better at, if you like, a global level and across the profession level at looking at the figures. And we are getting much better, actually, at dividing it up by practice area, practice group, and with modest exceptions in some categories of family work, actually it's a pretty consistent story that the men at the same level of call continue, on average, to earn more than women. What can be done about that? I think there needs to be, if you like, deep dives in chambers. And chambers have to say, well, okay, there seems to be some disparity overall. Are we contributing to that in chambers? And if so, why? And I think we have to be careful not to immediately jump to the conclusion that every time there's a difference, there's a problem. Because there are some people, anyone who's been head of chambers will know, and let's keep it just for the sake of argument, just to men. My chambers, there's some men who want to work almost every hour God gave, and there are others who don't. And that will affect their earnings. So differences don't always mean there's a problem, but if you do see differences, and if you do see that the men and women in chambers are consistently over a long period earning different amounts, I think you absolutely must try to investigate why that's happening. And if you can't explain it, then you've got a problem.
Switching to a different topic, as we're talking about the future, technology has to be, I've got a few questions in relation to that. You've mentioned AI, you've mentioned ChatGPT, but I wondered how the advances that we've already seen, thinking about disclosure tools, case management, where there could be other areas of advances that could improve the life of a barrister, other things such as other tasks that barristers have to undertake, such as legal research, maybe something around case management.
I was maybe slightly downbeat or maybe even negative about ChatGPT and the like, because I think it's very dangerous. It's really dangerous if you don't properly understand what it is doing and how it's doing it. But I hope that I'm not a Luddite, and it is clear beyond any doubt that if you're going to practice at the bar, you need to use all the tools that are available. I mean, when I was first a pupil, I had to go sticking in those little things into the law reports to find cases that had been cited in a subsequent case. Some of the younger people here have probably seen those little stickers in old law reports and wondered what on earth they are. Well, they were something that you could give pupils to do as a task. I think that was their main function. But things have changed enormously, and actually, I think some of the things in terms of small claims, the online portals, they're nothing to do with AI. They are just to do with doing what the whole of the rest of the world has done, rather before us, which is doing a lot of things online, because for people who have access to technology, it is quicker and cheaper. And I think we always have to be careful about those people who are excluded from almost anything that is done online. My parents would be a prime example of people falling into that category. We don't want to forget about people like that, but there are so many obvious advantages that we do need to embrace them. And I think we're getting better at that.
Do you have a sense of what technology would be beneficial, and equally what isn't needed, what tech isn't, what tech couldn't improve on?
Well, I think I'm very, very dubious about anything other than people taking decisions. Very cautious about that. So I hope, I'm even cautious about the idea which some people have floated, that you might get some form of AI, wouldn't be an LLM I don't think, but some form of AI to give a provisional view on the outcome of a case. I think the danger with that is having sufficient confidence that that's right, but maybe that will come in time. So I actually think that the things which we most like doing, which we ought as barristers to most like doing, which is trying to amass a huge amount of information and form a view on it and decide what the right questions to ask are, and then give advice and then advocate, all the things which we most like doing are the least suited to AI or to computers helping us, and all the things which we least like doing, like going through huge numbers of files to see whether what ought to be disclosed and what ought not, those tasks which are ghastly, I think we can get a lot of help from the disclosure platforms. But again, I would say, other people's experience may be different. I've only ever found them satisfactory if I've kind of understood how they're working. Exactly how are these search terms used? How are they combined? What's the population of documents that are looked at? So I think there's always a danger of saying, I do this, machines do that, let's see what the machine comes up with. In a way, we have to kind of partner with those systems better, understand exactly not how it's doing it, but what it's doing inside the box. And then you don't make so many mistakes, I think.
Sticking with the technology theme, social media, help or hinder?
Oh dear. There's something called the Twitter or the X community, isn't there? I sometimes think community is the wrong word to associate with either X or Twitter, because in the sense of improving the quality of our community of thought as lawyers, I don't think it's done very well. The BSB will be publishing some guidance soon, which I'm sure we will welcome on this, and everybody should look at that when it comes out. The BSB is fundamentally about professional standards. And the one point I would like to make about Twitter, which some of you will have heard me make before, is, for heaven's sake, don't think that just as long as it's not misconduct, it's okay to say it on Twitter. We're professional people. We should hold ourselves to higher standards than that. Don't say on Twitter things which you wouldn't say to people face to face. I would like to be able to share with you two real examples of people who've come to me in the course of this year who have been absolutely shattered by the impact of what other lawyers have said about them on Twitter. And of course, they don't share that, and it wouldn't be right for me to do so, save to say that if you had spoken to them, you would say what I'm going to say, which is particularly to senior people, the hurt and damage that you can cause in seconds, perhaps late at night, tweeting away, criticizing a more junior member of the profession, I think is quite difficult to estimate. I'm really troubled by that.
Thinking about troubling commentary, there have been, over the last few years, a number of statements that have been made by very senior leaders within our constitutional framework, associating lawyers with the causes of their cases, and indeed even criticism from the executive, from the government. Where do you see that sitting, or where would you like to see that that position in 10, 20 years' time? How do we get to a better scenario?
It has obviously been unsatisfactory. It's been unsatisfactory over the summer. We've said so. Lubna, who I know is here, the president of the Law Society, has said so. It was really good that we could say so together when there was a particularly dispiriting example which concerned a very distinguished immigration law solicitor. I think you would have had to have your head in the sand throughout August not to have seen some of that, even if you were on holiday. It goes up and down. There are many people in positions of responsibility who completely understand that barristers should not be associated with the causes of their client, but there appear to be some people who ought to know better and are forgetful and do not always remember that absolutely fundamental principle.
I can't finish this conversation coming from an organisation that protects or does its best to protect and defend the rule of law to ask you a question around that. And again, it's been an area that has been perhaps, well, certainly justice would say, under threat over the last 5, 10, maybe a little bit more years. Again, what needs to be done to ensure that foundation of a true justice system, a true just society, is not eroded any further?
Well, a good start, as you will know, Fiona, is to look at the report which you put out yesterday on the rule of law. If I may say so, I thought that the way in which it was summarised just captured kind of exactly where we were. And what the Justice Report says is it gives a series of examples over the last year, 2, 3 years, of things that have happened which individually you think, that's not good, that feels uncomfortable as against our normal conception of the rule of law. No one of them are on their own marking a complete abandonment of any idea that the rule of law is important. But the cumulative effect being a drip feed which just begins to undermine those principles. And I actually think it is, all of us have an obligation to call it out when it happens, to have nothing to do with it when it happens, and to try to get people to understand that an independent, truly independent judiciary, truly independent legal professionals who fight cases without fear or favour and without judging their clients are absolutely critical to a safe and stable society.
Thank you, Nick. Very well said. I'd love to keep continuing this conversation. I hope the audience would agree with that, but I've been given a very strong signal that I'm now to wrap things up. So I'll finish by saying thank you very much, Nick, for all the food for thought that you've given us this evening. Can I encourage everybody, there are some drinks that are going to be served, and if we can't actually continue the discussion on the stage, probably be even more fun to have discussions amongst yourselves very shortly. So thank you to Nick, thank you to Inner Temple for hosting us, thank you to you for coming, and please stay.
Thank you. Thanks so much.